The planet RE137 wasn't meant for humans. It was a death world in every sense of the word, a hostile wasteland wrapped in dense storms, relentless heat, and terrain that seemed deliberately designed to kill. Toxic air filled its lower valleys. Razor-sharp cliffs lined its mountainous regions. Even its forests were not places of refuge, but mazes of jagged vines and venomous predators. Every living thing on RE137 was built for survival. From the predatory creatures that stalked the nights to the dense, thorn-laden plants that seemed to thrive on human blood. The planet was unforgiving, unyielding, and had already consumed too many lives. It wasn't a place anyone would choose to live, let alone fight a war. But war wasn't a choice anymore. Humanity's expansion across the stars had brought it into conflict with an alien race known as the Varn, a brutal and calculating species that viewed negotiation as a waste of time and saw strength as the only language worth speaking. When they found RE137, a planet rich with rare minerals vital for military technology, they claimed it without hesitation. The first human mining colonies were wiped out within days. Messages sent for help went unanswered until it was too late. By the time reinforcements arrived, only bones remained. But humanity didn't retreat. It never did. That was one of its defining traits: adaptation, stubbornness, and an almost reckless refusal to surrender. What others saw as a death world, humans saw as a challenge. They didn't just want to fight for RE137, they wanted to survive it, conquer it, and turn the planet's cruelty into their weapon. The first deployment of soldiers learned the hard way that RE137 was as dangerous as the enemy. Half the casualties weren't even from combat but from the planet itself: heatstroke, sudden sinkholes, toxic gas eruptions. But every failure was a lesson, every loss a blueprint for how to survive. New strategies were developed. Soldiers adapted their gear and tactics. They built hardened outposts on high ground, where floods couldn't reach and visibility was clear for kilometers. They wore suits that filtered out toxins and shielded them from the harshest conditions. The war against the Varn wasn't just fought with bullets and bombs. It was fought with sweat, grit, and endless adjustments to a battlefield that refused to stay still. Patrols learned to navigate the maze-like forests without leaving trails. Drones hovered constantly overhead, watching for signs of ambushes or shifting weather patterns that could turn a clear day into a death trap. Supplies were dropped only at night, under cover of darkness, and even then, soldiers retrieved them in silence, knowing that the Varn's sensors were always listening. The Varn had thought the humans would break. They believed that the planet itself would do the work for them. But instead, humans learned how to live on RE137. Slowly, they stopped fighting against the world and started using it. Rockslides became natural traps. Acidic rainstorms that once forced retreats were timed and used to flush the Varn from their hiding places. The dense undergrowth that once made travel impossible became a shield, masking human movements and allowing them to strike without warning. Weeks turned into months, and months into years. Every battle left scars on the land, but the human soldiers grew harder, tougher. They learned to outlast the Varn, waiting them out in conditions the aliens couldn't endure. While the Varn relied on rapid assaults, the humans became masters of attrition, knowing that time was on their side. Victory didn't come with a single battle. There was no grand moment of triumph, no dramatic showdown. It was a slow, grinding process, fought ridge by ridge, valley by valley, outpost by outpost. The humans pushed the Varn back, their determination wearing down even the most stubborn enemy positions. They fought through exhaustion and loss, through brutal storms and endless nights, each small victory building on the last until the tide began to turn for good. When the final push came, it wasn't a surprise. The Varn had already been retreating for weeks. Their supply lines stretched too thin, their forces weakened by constant skirmishes and the unrelenting environment. The last battle took place in a deep canyon at the planet's southern pole, a natural fortress carved into the rock. It should have been a perfect defensive position. It was the kind of place the Varn could hold for months, maybe years. But the humans had learned too much. They had mapped every crack, every ledge. They knew the wind patterns that swept through the canyon and the precise moment when the temperature would drop just enough for the toxic gases to rise from the depths. They waited until the conditions were perfect, and then they struck. Not with a full assault but with patience and precision. They sealed the exits and waited, letting the planet do the rest. By dawn, it was over. RE137 was theirs. The war had cost more than anyone could measure, lives lost, years spent in constant struggle, but the victory was real. The survivors stood on the edge of that canyon, breathing the thin, bitter air, knowing they had done what had once seemed impossible. The Varn had underestimated humanity's will to survive, its ability to endure and adapt. RE137 had tried to break them, but in the end, it had made them stronger. The planet that had taken so much from them had become their greatest weapon, and as the sun rose over the jagged horizon, turning the barren landscape into a sea of golden light, the soldiers knew one thing for certain. There were no rules of war on a death world, only survival. And humans, more than any other species, knew how to survive. The sky was a bruised shade of gray, the heavy clouds crawling across it like a slow-moving tide, and the air was thick with ash and dust. The ground trembled every so often, a distant rumble beneath the earth hinting at another bombardment, somewhere beyond the shattered horizon. The planet RE137 wasn't supposed to be a battleground. It was a death world, classified as barely habitable, with its hostile weather, poisonous flora, and endless storms that swept across the surface with ferocity unmatched by anything found on Earth. It was the kind of place you wouldn't voluntarily visit unless you had no choice, or if you were human. Humans had learned the hard way how to adapt to hostile environments. They had been called reckless, stubborn, and sometimes outright suicidal by other species, but they were also survivors. No other species in the galaxy understood war quite like humans. They knew how to take the worst situation and turn it into something survivable. If not winnable, it wasn't bravery. It was something deeper, an instinct honed through centuries of struggle and conflict. The conflict on RE137 had started small, a minor dispute over mineral rights. The planet was rich in iridium, a resource crucial for interstellar engines. At first, it had been a corporate matter. Mining colonies were established, contracts signed, and work had begun. Then the Zuran Dominion had laid claim to the planet, declaring that it fell within their territory. Negotiations failed, and things escalated quickly. What began as skirmishes between mining outposts turned into full-scale war. The Zuran forces were known for their efficiency. Their soldiers were disciplined, their tactics calculated. They used advanced drone swarms and plasma-based artillery that could level entire hillsides. They didn't waste time on unnecessary engagements. Precision was their strength. Humans, on the other hand, were not precise. They were adaptable, chaotic, and relentless. They fought like the storms that battered RE137, unpredictable and brutal. When the Zuran troops pushed them back from one outpost, they didn't retreat for long. They dug in, set traps, and hit back when least expected. Every inch of ground taken by the Zurans was paid for in blood and sweat. The terrain itself became part of the battle. The jagged mountains and deep ravines served as natural fortresses. Swamps filled with toxic gases became death traps for the unprepared. The humans used it all to their advantage, learning to live off the land in ways the Zurans couldn't. They harvested edible fungi from caves, collected water from the condensation that formed on rocks in the mornings, and made crude shelters from the twisted, thorn-covered trees that dotted the landscape. Every night was a battle against the planet as much as it was against the enemy. The Zurans struggled in these conditions. Their supply lines stretched thin, and their advanced technology was vulnerable to the planet's harsh electromagnetic storms. Their drones malfunctioned in the heavy rains, and their targeting systems failed in the thick fog that often blanketed the valleys. What they had in firepower, They lacked in endurance. The human soldiers, however, thrived in this chaos. They didn't need perfect conditions. They didn't need a flawless plan. They just needed a chance. One by one, the Zuran positions fell. Sometimes it was a direct assault. Other times it was sabotage, power cells stolen in the night, vehicles left inoperable after a surprise raid. The Zurans learned to fear the darkness, knowing that somewhere out there, humans were watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Weeks turned into months, and still, the war raged on. Both sides had suffered heavy losses, but only one side was getting stronger. The humans had learned to use the terrain better than the planet's native predators. What once felt like an alien world now felt like home, or something close to it. It was near the end of the third month that the tide finally turned for good. A massive Zuran base stood in the middle of a crater, surrounded by jagged cliffs on three sides. It was their last stronghold on RE137, heavily fortified and stocked with enough firepower to hold off an army. The humans didn't send an army. They didn't need to. They waited for one of the planet's infamous storms to roll in, bringing with it high winds and sheets of acid rain. Under the cover of the storm, a team of engineers crept through the mud, carrying makeshift explosives crafted from salvaged Zuran equipment. They planted charges on the supports of the base's perimeter wall and retreated just before dawn. When the storm finally cleared, the charges detonated, collapsing the wall and sending a section of the base crumbling into the crater. The humans swarmed in through the breach, rough, battered, and soaked to the bone, but still fighting with every ounce of strength they had left. The Zurans fought back, but it was futile. They were tired, demoralized, and unprepared for an assault in such conditions. By the end of the day, the human flag stood over the ruins of the base. The last Zuran commander surrendered, his armor cracked and blackened by smoke. The war was over. RE137 belonged to the humans now, not because they had better weapons or more soldiers, but because they refused to give up. Victory didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like survival. As the human soldiers stood among the wreckage, watching the storm clouds retreat into the distance, they knew they had earned this land the hard way. RE137 was no longer just a hostile world. It was proof of what humans were capable of when pushed to their limits. It wasn't pretty, and it wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and that was enough. The sky above RE137, known as the most hostile Deathworld ever recorded, was a swirling mass of dark clouds and dust storms. The atmosphere was heavy with ash and smelled of burning rock. Volcanic mountains stretched across the land, their blackened slopes scarred by centuries of tectonic warfare. The ground itself seemed alive, constantly shifting, cracking, and crumbling beneath the weight of anyone foolish enough to walk across it unprepared. Yet humanity, stubborn as ever, had come here willingly. This wasn't a mission of exploration, it was a war for survival. RE137 wasn't just hostile to life, it actively tried to kill it. Toxic winds scoured the landscape, while temperatures swung violently from freezing cold at night to blistering heat during the day. The flora had developed spiked armor and acidic sap. The fauna, the few species that had survived in this place, were grotesque predators with thick scales and eyes that reflected no light, perfectly adapted to hunt in the endless twilight. Despite this, the planet was rich in resources, a treasure trove of rare minerals and compounds essential for advanced technology. It was valuable enough to fight for, and humanity wasn't the only species that had noticed. The enemy, the Arakiri, had come first. A brutal, war-hardened species. They had built fortresses in the jagged cliffs and expanded underground networks to avoid the worst of the planet's conditions. They thought they had claimed RE137 for themselves. Then humanity arrived, not with the intent of sharing, but with every intention of taking it. It was nothing personal. For humans, survival had always been about adaptation and overcoming impossible odds, and this war was no different. The rules of war here were simple: adapt fast, hit hard, and never stop moving. Humans had learned that lesson early. Their first wave of troops had suffered terrible losses. The environment killed as many as the enemy did. Soldiers died of exposure, crushed by collapsing tunnels, or taken by the night's hunters. The RE used these conditions to their advantage, ambushing the disoriented humans, dragging them into the depths, leaving only bloodstains in the dirt as a reminder. But humanity was nothing if not relentless. Every defeat became a lesson. They learned to wear adaptive armor that could withstand the rapid temperature shifts. Their weapons were modified to function in the planet's volatile atmosphere, and their outposts were built into the natural landscape, blending seamlessly with the environment. Slowly, painfully, they turned the tide. A major offensive came during the planet's brief, 2-week calm season. When the storms subsided just enough for large-scale operations, the humans called it the push. The goal was simple: seize the RE137's primary command base, an underground fortress buried beneath a craggy mountain ridge. If they could take it, the war would turn decisively in their favor. The operation began at dawn. Human artillery opened up first, firing specialized munitions designed to burrow into the earth before detonating. The explosion sent massive plumes of dust and rock into the air, collapsing sections of the RE137's tunnels. Ground teams moved in next, squads of soldiers in reinforced exosuits, their visors glowing faintly in the dim light. They moved in tight formation, scanning every shadow for movement. This was no ordinary battlefield. Every rock could hide a predator, and every gust of wind could be carrying poison. The RE137 fought back fiercely, but something had shifted. The humans weren't just surviving anymore, they were winning. Every inch of ground was taken at a cost, but they pushed forward relentlessly. They sealed off tunnels, cut supply lines, and destroyed key fortifications with surgical precision. What the RE137 hadn't expected was how quickly humans adapted, how they thrived in chaos and uncertainty. By the 5th day of the offensive, the fortress was within reach. The RE137, desperate and cornered, launched a counterattack. It was brutal and chaotic. The ground trembled under the weight of the battle. The air was filled with the sound of gunfire, explosions, and the guttural roars of the RE137 warriors. Human soldiers fought with everything they had, pushing themselves beyond exhaustion. In the final hours of the battle, Captain Elias Ward led the charge into the heart of the fortress. His squad had been through hell together, surviving ambushes, storms, and days without sleep, but they weren't about to stop now. They breached the final barrier, a massive gate carved into the mountain itself, and stormed the command center. It was a brutal, close-quarters fight, but in the end, the humans prevailed. The RE137 leader lay dead, and the fortress was theirs. Outside, the storm began to rise again, howling across the landscape. But for the first time since the war began, it felt like a victory cry rather than a warning. The humans consolidated their position, fortifying the captured base and preparing for the inevitable counterattacks. But they knew the worst was over. They had done what everyone said was impossible, turned a Deathworld into a stronghold. In the days that followed, the remaining RE137 forces retreated into the deeper parts of the planet. Scattered and broken, the humans didn't chase them. There was no need. The message had been sent loud and clear. RE137 belonged to humanity now. The rules of war had changed. On RE137, survival wasn't enough, you had to conquer the chaos, and no one did that better than humans. The wind screamed across the jagged plains of RE137, whipping dust and ash into the sky, turning the horizon into a churning wall of gray. Nothing about this place welcomed life. The ground was dry and cracked, the sky hung heavy with sulfur clouds, and the air itself carried a bitter sting that burned the lungs. Yet here, in this forgotten corner of the galaxy, humanity had dug in and refused to let go. It had been 5 years since the first settlers arrived. hopeful and ambitious. The mineral deposits deep within RE137's crust were among the richest ever discovered. A single vein of the rare element curium could fuel entire fleets of starships. The potential was too great to ignore, even if the risks were high. Those early years were filled with optimism. Modular habitats sprang up across the rocky landscape. Machinery hummed day and night, drilling deep into the planet's surface. The settlers knew they were far from Earth, but they believed they could build something new here, something lasting. That hope was shattered when the Varn came. The Varn struck without warning, their ships descending from the clouds like dark, silent shadows. Their first attack reduced the main settlement to a field of smoldering ruins. Communications were cut. Outposts fell one by one. Those who survived the initial assault found themselves trapped in a war they hadn't prepared for. The first instinct was to flee, to evacuate the survivors and abandon the colony. But retreat wasn't an option. The Varn weren't interested in negotiations or prisoners. They wanted the planet, and anyone who stood in their way would be destroyed. So humanity fought. In the beginning, it was chaos. Civilians with no combat experience were pressed into service. Engineers became riflemen, doctors became field medics. Every able-bodied person took up arms. The military reinforcements that eventually arrived found a colony barely clinging to life, but they also found something else, an unbreakable will to survive. The Varn were relentless. They knew every weakness, every soft spot in human defenses. They came in waves, testing the limits of human endurance, each assault more brutal than the last. But the humans adapted. They fortified their remaining positions, turning mining tunnels into defensive labyrinths. They scavenged destroyed vehicles and turned them into makeshift artillery. Supplies were rationed. Water, already scarce, was filtered and reused endlessly. Every resource was stretched to its breaking point. But somehow, it was enough. The humans learned to fight like the planet itself, harsh, unforgiving, and unyielding. For every attack the Varn launched, the humans had an answer. Camouflaged bunkers sprang up along key choke points. Hit-and-run tactics wore down the enemy's supply lines. Ambushes in narrow canyons turned once advancing armies into shattered wreckage. The Varn had underestimated them. They thought humans were weak, fragile. They couldn't have been more wrong. Then came the siege of Blackridge, the battle that would decide the fate of RE137. Blackridge Outpost was the last major stronghold standing between the Varn and total control of the planet. It sat atop a massive plateau, its walls carved from the surrounding rock, nearly impregnable. If Blackridge fell, there would be nothing left to stop the Varn from sweeping across the remaining colonies. The siege lasted 57 days. The Varn threw everything they had at Blackridge: artillery barrages, airstrikes, even biological attacks designed to poison the air inside the fortress. But the defenders held. Night after night, they repelled wave after wave of attackers. Their ammunition dwindled. Rations were cut to a single meal a day. Sleep was a luxury no one could afford. Still, they refused to surrender. On the 56th day, with the walls crumbling and the defenders down to their last reserves, the Varn launched their final assault. It should have been the end. But humanity had one last trick up its sleeve. The engineers at Blackridge had been working on a desperate plan, a final gamble that might turn the tide. Deep beneath the fortress lay a network of old mining tunnels, long since abandoned. They had filled those tunnels with explosives, enough to level the entire plateau. It was a risky plan. If the timing was off, it could bury the defenders along with the enemy. But there was no other choice. As the Varn forces breached the outer defenses and poured into the fortress, the signal was given. A series of deafening explosions tore through the ground, collapsing the tunnels and triggering a massive landslide. Entire sections of the plateau crumbled, swallowing the Varn army in an avalanche of rock and fire. When the dust settled, Blackridge still stood, damaged but defiant. The survivors emerged into the dawn light, battered and exhausted. but victorious. For the first time in years, the skies above RE137 were quiet. The Varn were gone, their forces broken, their will shattered. The cost had been staggering, thousands of lives lost, entire settlements reduced to ash. But in the end, humanity had held its ground. The survivors knew the fight wasn't truly over. The Varn might return someday, stronger and more determined than before. But for now, RE137 belonged to humanity. They had earned it with blood and sweat, with sacrifice and resilience. The war had taken everything from them, but it had also forged something unbreakable, proof that no matter how harsh the world, no matter how impossible the odds, humanity would endure. It always did.